You may know Sisyphus for the rock, that ever-returning symbol of ceaseless labor. But few stop to consider how long it took to get to the punishment phase. And fewer still realize that before Sisyphus ever touched a boulder, he was entangled in a deeply tedious web of civic administration. What we often forget, or more likely never knew, is that Sisyphus was, first and foremost, a bureaucrat, not a tragic hero, not a criminal mastermind, a man of forms, laws, and city charters. Sisyphus ruled Ifra, a city-state nestled where later Corinth would rise. His reign wasn't marked by war or conquest, but by civic reform. Not the exciting kind, no philosophical upheaval or grand republics. No, Sisyphus's brand of leadership focused on drainage permits, census enforcement, and municipal zoning. While other rulers raised armies, Sisyphus raised regulations. He installed the first proto-civil registry in Greek memory, a meticulous system of recording births, deaths, and taxes. Scholars now believe that this registry, though likely oral or token-based, functioned with surprising efficiency. So efficient, in fact, that gods took notice, but not the heroic kind of notice. More the he's becoming a nuisance kind. Sisyphus, it is said, once fined Poseidon's priests for overextending temple boundaries onto public land. A clay tablet found near the supposed site of ancient Ifra outlines what may be the world's first documented temple code violation. But where Sisyphus truly earned his underworld appointment was in his love for the legal loophole. When a local tributary threatened to flood homes during the spring melt, Sisyphus didn't divert it. He didn't build a dam. He declared the area uninhabitable by municipal decree and imposed a property tax relief on the residents. Problem solved on paper. It is here that the gods began to lose patience when Thanatos, god of death, came to claim him for a minor transgression, the exact crime lost to history, but likely a zoning violation. Sisyphus filed an injunction. Allegedly, he asked Thanatos to demonstrate how the shackles of the underworld worked before signing anything. While Thanatos complied, Sisyphus promptly shackled the god himself. Now, the part of the myth everyone remembers is that humans stopped dying. But few appreciate the downstream effects. Hospitals overran, food ran short, and tax collection became difficult. After all, the dead don't pay taxes, but neither do the undead. The spreadsheets no longer aligned. Life expectancy data became meaningless. Sisyphus, temporarily victorious, used this breathing room to rewrite Ephora's death rituals. Cremation permits tripled. Mourning periods shortened. Funerary services were now subject to licensing. He was preparing the city to function without death, not out of rebellion, but out of administrative necessity. The gods, predictably, issued a celestial memorandum. It's not dramatic to imagine a divine scroll floating down from Olympus, inked with annoyance. It instructed Hades to retrieve Thanatos and Sisyphus both, but even then, Sisyphus had countermeasures. He instructed his wife Merope to forego burial rites. He wanted to appear unburied, a technicality in ancient belief that prevented peaceful passage to the underworld. When dragged before Hades, he pleaded his case with earnest bureaucratic fervor. "I was not buried," he explained, and the protocol is clear. Whether out of exasperation or genuine confusion, Hades released him back to the surface. And what did Sisyphus do with his second life? He returned to civic duty. In his final years, Sisyphus drafted a proposal to expand the city's aqueduct system. Surviving fragments hint at a plan involving redirected springs and tiered drainage, not for grandeur, but for population management. The proposal was denied by the newly formed municipal council, established while he was in the underworld. His old systems had been partially dismantled in his absence, considered oppressively efficient. Still, he persisted. Archaeological evidence, specifically rows of unmarked drainage ditches near ancient Corinth, suggests Sisyphus began work on the project regardless of approval. Unauthorized civic improvement, a final act of administrative rebellion, but it wouldn't last. Hermes, the enforcer, arrived with no interest in procedure, no petitions, no hearings. Sisyphus was taken to Tartarus, stripped of his charter, and sentenced not for defying gods, but for the greater offense of embarrassing them through endless technicalities. And yet, even there, the punishment was strangely fitting. Some see the rock as cruel, poetic justice, but it may have been worse than that. It was metaphor made literal, a task forever in progress, never completed, never filed. To a man who spent his life writing, stamping, and reviewing, it was the bureaucratic nightmare, a task without end, a project with no oversight, an effort with no system of accountability, no parchment to sign, no audit trail. The gods could have tormented Sisyphus with fire or darkness. Instead, they gave him unstructured labor. Perhaps it was the one punishment he truly could not escape. But before we ask why Sisyphus's punishment was eternal, perhaps we must ask something more peculiar. We left off with a question. Why did it take the gods so long to punish Sisyphus? The myth, as retold across generations, tends to gloss over this detail. We imagine that once Sisyphus defied death, Zeus struck him down with a bolt of justice, and that was that. But history, even mythical history, is rarely so neat. The truth is that divine punishment wasn't swift because even the gods had their process. And in that process, Sisyphus had found his most unexpected strength. He was, quite simply, very annoying to prosecute. The Greek pantheon was not a united front. Each god operated with a kind of divine fiefdom. Hades in the underworld, Zeus on Olympus, Poseidon over the seas. Jurisdictional disputes were common, but punishment that required consensus. Sisyphus had irritated multiple gods, but none severely enough on their own to warrant the eternal punishment he eventually received. Let's examine their grievances. Hades saw Sisyphus as a procedural threat. The man had detained Thanatos, disrupted the death schedule, and appended the entire system of soul intake. Yet Hades, ever literal, needed proper death rites to claim a soul permanently. Zeus, while irritated, had larger concerns: wars, oaths, sacrifices. Sisyphus's defiance didn't register as rebellion. It was a technicality. The king of gods had little patience for paperwork. Poseidon wanted to flood Ephyra after Sisyphus revealed the location of one of Zeus's secret trysts, but lacked the authority to interfere with a city that lay inland. So what do powerful beings do when no one wants to take direct responsibility? They delegate. A divine committee, informal but no less real, began to form. Stories passed down from late archaic sources suggest that a hearing was held. Not a dramatic court, like one might find in a mythic epic, but more like a peer review. The gods met, discussed the Sisyphus problem, and promptly disagreed on everything. Hera supposedly argued that if mortals began gaming the system of death, it would diminish divine authority across all domains. Athena countered that cleverness should not be punished, but redirected. Apollo, characteristically indifferent, remarked that all men die eventually. The result was a temporary impasse, not because of mercy, but because no god wanted to deal with the administrative overhead of actually enforcing a punishment. And Sisyphus, he used the time well. Upon return from the underworld, his second, he reformed the temple tax system to include optional donations for funeral equity. He claimed it was designed to make death more accessible to the poor. He also opened Ephyra's first tribunal for dispute arbitration. Minor cases, land conflicts, marriage, dowry enforcement, temple noise complaints were reviewed weekly by a panel of civic elders. Citizens began to believe in the law, not the gods. This, more than anything, may have sealed his fate. Hermes was dispatched to review the situation, not because of strength or cruelty, but because Hermes was a messenger, a god of transitions. His role, after all, included guiding souls to the afterlife. If Sisyphus had found a loophole, Hermes would find the closing bracket. The first thing Hermes noted upon arriving in Ephyra was that Sisyphus had built an actual Office of Divine Relations, a modest building stocked with papyrus records of every interaction between mortals and gods. Every festival, prayer, offering, and supposed divine dream was catalogued and indexed. Hermes requested an audience. Sisyphus delayed politely, of course, scheduling conflicts, pending hearings, weather complications. Days passed. When Hermes finally entered the office, Sisyphus greeted him not as a god, but as a representative. He offered him tea. He showed him the complaint log, the civic budget, the list of approved rituals. Hermes returned to Olympus and delivered a single report. The man has made bureaucracy divine. There's an often overlooked passage in the Orphic fragments that mentions Sisyphus not by name, but by description, the one who turned their attention to process over power. Scholars interpret this as an early commentary on how his defiance wasn't rooted in ego, but in administration. He didn't fight the gods, he outweighted them. Eventually, the gods were forced to make a decision, not because they found a new crime, but because Sisyphus had made their negligence too obvious. Zeus, always sensitive to appearances, finally acted, not out of justice, but out of embarrassment. The gods could not allow mortals to believe they could delay divine punishment through technical mastery. But even then, action was slow. By this point, Sisyphus was old. His records, both civic and personal, were meticulous. He designated a line of succession. He'd deconstructed every myth about himself and rewritten it in the city's civic records. The gods no longer seemed mysterious. They were simply unreliable administrators. Before the final sentence was rendered, Hades himself came to see Sisyphus. It was not a dramatic confrontation, no dark cloaks, no river Styx at their feet, just two administrators talking in the sunlit office of a city planner. Hades, leaning on his staff, reportedly asked, "Do you regret it?" Sisyphus, according to later retellings, replied, "Do you?" There was silence. Then, gently, Hades said, "There is no form for what comes next." To which Sisyphus said, "Then you'll have to file a new one." It was, perhaps, the last real victory Sisyphus ever had. When he finally entered Tartarus, he did so without resistance. No trial, no vote, no memo. Just the silent acceptance of a man whose tactics had run their course. But even in punishment, something changed. The gods no longer trusted mortals to obey out of fear. They saw that order could be challenged by knowledge, by men who paid attention, who remembered, who documented, and they never forgot it. Which leads us to an even deeper question. One not about gods or myths, but about us. By the time Sisyphus reached Tartarus, escorted, as tradition tells us, not by force, but by resignation, the bureaucracy he had spent a lifetime building had already begun to decay. Without his obsessive oversight, the civil registries of Ifra grew dusty. Hearings were delayed. Disputes were settled with old swords rather than orderly scrolls. Mortals forgot that he had once paused the very rhythm of death itself, not with violence, but with paperwork. But for Sisyphus, the real story was just beginning. He arrived not in chains, but with a reputation. The only man who had weaponized administration against the divine. And the gods had no intention of making that mistake again. So they crafted a punishment, both cruel and poetic, yet perhaps still misunderstood. There are many ways to interpret the rock. To some, it is a metaphor for futility, the eternal task that can never be completed. To others, it is karmic retribution, the weight of Sisyphus's misdeeds pressing down upon him forever. But if you study the punishment through the lens of his prior life, another possibility emerges. The rock wasn't random, it was custom designed. Sisyphus, the man who created the perfect administrative system, is condemned to a task with no end, no progress report, no metrics. It cannot be evaluated or optimized. There is no best practice for rolling a boulder uphill, only repetition to someone who loved systems and results. This is a special kind of agony. Imagine a man used to schedules, procedures, and signatures, now faced with eternal labor that cannot be audited or even explained. No one records his work, no one verifies compliance, no divine stamp, no appeals process. He lifts, he rolls, the rock falls. He begins again. It is the first truly non-bureaucratic punishment in a life defined by structure. Some later philosophers argued the rock was not literal at all. They saw Sisyphus not as a mythic figure, but as a model of human suffering. Camus, centuries later, would famously write that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, a man who embraces his meaningless task as a form of rebellion. But the ancient Greeks were more literal. They believed Tartarus was a place. They believed rocks could be moved by will. And they believed that the soul could endure pain indefinitely. Still, fragments from obscure sources, such as the scrolls of Dryan, now lost, suggest an alternative version, that Sisyphus, ever the cunning mind, found ways to document his punishment even in Tartarus. There are whispered tales of grooves carved into the stone, tally marks notched in the walls of his path, measurements of slope angles etched by bloodied fingers. The gods may have tried to give him chaos, but he gave it structure, a rhythm, a process, and eventually, it is said, the rock began to follow the same trajectory each time. Even in Tartarus, Sisyphus retained a kind of authority. The other punished souls, Ixion on his wheel, Tantalus with his unreachable water, began to mimic his strategies. They marked their cycles, counted repetitions, tried to predict the god's behavior. In his own way, Sisyphus became a civil servant of the underworld. Not officially. There was no appointment, no title, but influence is rarely formal. He became a pattern in the chaos, a living, groaning embodiment of order, not the grand order of Olympus, but the small, stubborn kind that grows from repetition and record-keeping. When new souls arrived in Tartarus, it was said that they watched him first, watched how he lifted, where he stood, how he paced his breath, how he learned to endure. Because the rock, for all its absurdity, could be studied back in the world above. Sisyphus's name eventually faded into fable. Ephra was swallowed into Corinth. Temples collapsed. Drainage ditches eroded. His reforms, so precise in their time, were undone by war, nature, and neglect. But small pieces remained. An oddly structured tax record in Corinth bore resemblance to his census format. A local prayer included a line that sounded more like a legal clause than a hymn. One particularly dull city official once remarked during a hearing, "Let us not rush." Even the gods had to deliberate on Sisyphus. And so he lingered, not as a rebel, not as a sinner, but as a slow erosion, the pebble that began the avalanche of questioning divine efficiency. Some versions of the myth say that Sisyphus eventually went mad, that he forgot his name, his city, even the rock itself, that he rolled simply because it was what he had always done. Others say he began to teach, that new souls, newly punished, would find themselves drawn to his methodical approach to suffering. He became the reluctant administrator of eternity's cruelest department. But maybe the most profound version is the simplest, that after countless millennia, he stopped resenting the rock, not because he forgave the gods, but because he accepted what they could never understand. Even a meaningless task gains meaning when it is studied. Even torment becomes routine. Even suffering can be scheduled. Sisyphus had beaten them, after all, not with escape, not with rebellion, but with the one force stronger than divine wrath: bureaucracy. Sisyphus reminds us that systems, for all their dullness, can be subversive. That routine is not weakness. That repetition, even without reward, is a kind of persistence. And maybe that's why his story, told and retold across millennia, still endures. Because deep down, we all know the feeling of pushing something uphill, over and over, with no end in sight. You've likely heard the tale. Theseus, the brave Athenian hero, descends into the Minotaur's labyrinth, armed with a sword and a thread. He slays the beast, escapes the maze, and sails off into myth. A compact story of heroism. But myths are rarely that simple. What happened after the Minotaur died? Who maintained the labyrinth while it was in use? Who swept the floors? And why? Did no one ever consider lighting? This story is not about Theseus, nor about the Minotaur. This is the story of Ariadne, and the long-forgotten labor force that kept the most famous maze in Greek mythology from falling into total disrepair. First, we must understand the nature of the labyrinth, while later romanticized as a mythic structure built by dataless archaeological interpretations of the palace at Knossos on Crete, suggests something far more grounded: a complex administrative center. The labyrinth may not have been a literal prison of stone corridors, but a sprawling, poorly organized palace with countless rooms, interconnected halls, storage spaces, and religious nooks. It was confusing. dim, alive, with the smells of grain, oil, livestock, and ritual incense. The Minotaur, a metaphor, perhaps, for the monstrous administrative complexity of empire. And within this complexity stood Ariadne, not merely a princess, but likely a priestess bureaucrat, deeply embedded in the rituals, record-keeping, and daily operations of Minoan life. Most retellings reduce Ariadne to a love-struck enabler, the woman who gave Theseus the thread. But this perspective ignores the logistical miracle she accomplished. First, thread doesn't just appear. The flax had to be harvested, combed, spun, dyed, to provide a thread long enough to guide a man through a multi-level complex required forethought, labor, and materials. This was not romance. This was logistics. Second, she understood the blueprints. Oral tradition describes Daedalus as the original architect, but even he reportedly struggled to navigate the maze. Ariadne, on the other hand, lived among its walls. She had likely memorized not just the layout, but the flow, which corridors filled with water in winter, which doors swelled shut with humidity, which stone steps creaked loud enough to give away your position. She was, in effect, the operations manager of the labyrinth, the person who made sure it functioned, both as a prison and a performance. And what of the Minotaur, traditionally portrayed as a monstrous being, confined to the labyrinth and fed human tributes from Athens? But again, consider the logistics. Feeding a half-human creature required procurement, meat, water, waste disposal, guards, possibly. Or was it all ceremonial? Were the tributes part of a larger theatrical process, a public sacrifice to maintain political order? If so, Ariadne would have overseen it. There's evidence in Linear B tablets from Nasus that list grain and livestock allotments, with odd notations of sacrifice or for the bull. These could refer to the Minotaur, or they might refer to cult rituals invoking the sacred bull figure of Minoan religion. The line between myth and administration blurs quickly. Regardless, the implication is clear. Ariadne ran the show. She ensured the labyrinth operated, that sacrifices, whether symbolic or literal, occurred on schedule, that storerooms were stocked, that the Minotaur, metaphorical or otherwise, didn't die of neglect. One forgotten fact about labyrinths: they require maintenance. Stone corridors collapse, mold accumulates, torches go out. If the structure was truly vast, someone had to tend to it. But secrecy was essential. Maintenance staff could not simply roam freely. They needed direction and oversight. It's likely that Ariadne employed a small, trusted team of servants. Or officials. Perhaps eunuchs. Perhaps sworn cult members. They would sweep, clean, reinforce. Some may have vanished, gotten lost. Others may have memorized the pathways so well they became ghost-like figures, blending with shadow. In this way, the labyrinth wasn't just a prison. It was an ecosystem, requiring constant attention. Ariadne was not its prisoner. She was its steward. Now, we return to the thread. On the surface, a clever trick. In reality, a revolution in wayfinding. By giving Theseus the thread, Ariadne wasn't simply saving him. She was recording data. The thread turned the labyrinth from chaos into map. It was the first known instance of linear navigation in a non-linear space, a concept not explored again in Western thinking until centuries later in Roman military logistics. And it raises a deeper question. Did Ariadne plan to abandon the labyrinth all along? Or did she merely grow tired of maintaining a system whose only purpose was confusion? Theseus may have believed he was escaping a beast, but Ariadne, she was escaping a job before Theseus arrived. Ariadne had likely spent her life in meticulous ritual, preparing festivals, monitoring storage logs, overseeing the labyrinth's damp stone arteries. She lived in the hum of candle wax, echoing footsteps, whispered prayers. After his departure, no one maintained the labyrinth, and no one rebuilt it, but its influence, the idea of a structured maze, lived on. Ariadne's thread would become the model for every future attempt at order, the line through the fog, the marked path through uncertainty, every roadmap, every administrative flowchart, every evacuation diagram. It all began with a woman who knew which corridors collapsed in spring, which leaves us with a strange question. We last left Ariadne watching the sails of Theseus's ship drift into the Aegean, the thread unraveled behind them like the severed connection to a life she had meticulously managed. The labyrinth was no longer her burden. But what happens when the one person who holds an institution together walks away? This section explores what followed the thread, not the mythic romance, but the collapse of infrastructure, the administrative void, and the slow unraveling of a system held together by little more than memory, repetition, and the quiet work of a single woman. Ariadne's departure left the labyrinth without oversight. The system she had operated, unseen, yet essential, could not function in her absence. In the myth, the Minotaur is slain. But in the structure of empire, that creature wasn't just a beast. It was purpose. The rituals, sacrifices, and seasonal offerings all revolved around the labyrinth. Priests depended on it. So did fear. So did civic unity. And with Ariadne gone, no one knew how to keep the doors from jamming shut in the rainy season. There are no records, not real ones, of what happened in Nasus in the days immediately following, but it's likely the priesthood scrambled. Labyrinth staff, perhaps long confined to roles they barely understood, were asked to step up. They failed. Fires may have gone unlit. Corridors grew dark. Mice returned. One dropped thread had untied the order of the entire complex. It's tempting to imagine Ariadne's thread as a one-time solution, but think again. The labyrinth wasn't designed to be escaped. Yet the thread created a record, a literal line that, if preserved, could have mapped the structure. That kind of documentation was dangerous in a culture dependent on mystery and fear. By giving Theseus the thread, Ariadne didn't just betray a beast, she declassified a sacred space, and that may explain her hasty departure. While Theseus is remembered for killing the Minotaur, Ariadne destroyed the system that required one. She ended a logistical empire of shadows and silence. But revolutions, even silent ones, often end poorly for their architects. In most versions of the myth, Theseus leaves Ariadne sleeping on the island of Naxos. Why? Scholars have speculated. Everything from divine intervention to emotional immaturity. But from an administrative lens, something else is at play. Theseus, a prince of Athens, may have realized what he had done. He hadn't just escaped a maze, he had dismantled an international ritual mechanism. By killing the Minotaur and stealing Ariadne, he had severed Crete's control over its vassal cities. The regular tributes young Athenians sent to the maze served both as punishment and submission. Without the labyrinth, Athens no longer had to obey. But without Ariadne, Theseus also couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't map the system, couldn't replicate it. Ariadne knew too much, and perhaps he didn't want to share that knowledge, so she was left behind, not just as a spurned lover, but as an inconvenient witness to the erasure of one of the ancient world's most intricate administrative systems. Ariadne doesn't disappear from myth after Naxos. She is discovered by Dionysus, god of wine, madness, and ecstasy. He marries her, gives her a crown, raises her to immortality. The myth romanticizes this, the forgotten woman rescued by a divine hedonist. But let's look again. Dionysus was a god of ritual chaos. Festivals in his name involved drinking, cross-dressing, ecstatic dance, but they also required management, permits, amphory counts, temple logistics. His cult, while chaotic in image, was precise in execution. Who better to manage it than Ariadne? This pairing wasn't just romantic, it was functional. Ariadne went from managing a system built on suppression to one built on release, but both required coordination, scheduling, and a woman who knew how to balance myth with logistics. Some sources claim she introduced the structured calendar, 2 Dionysian festivals, separating planting rites from harvesting rites, tracking lunar cycles, indexing temple assets. She didn't abandon structure. She reinvented it, from Nasus to Naxos to Olympus. Ariadne's thread never really stopped. It simply shifted shape, from literal string to knowledge passed quietly, to the logistical backbone of Dionysian cults across the Mediterranean in the city of Nysa. Cult officials known as Ariadne helped organize wine festivals. In Delphi, priestesses adopted her spiral dance as part of ritual procession. In later Roman times, some grain records were still marked with a diagonal line known as Ariadne's path, used to denote a record that should not be tampered with. Her thread, her mark, her method, it all lived on, hidden in ledgers, rituals, temple walls. And perhaps that is her greatest legacy, the image most commonly preserved of Ariadne. Today is deceptively serene, a reclining figure on ancient pottery, a woman watching the stars as Dionysus lifts her into divinity. But the story behind that stillness is far more intricate. Ariadne's thread may have unraveled the labyrinth, but it also tied together a legacy of systems thinking, ritual design, and the quiet infrastructure of belief. This final section explores what happened after the myths ended, not in epics, but in cultural inheritance, cultic practice, and forgotten paperwork, even after the death of the Minotaur and Ariadne's departure. The idea of the labyrinth didn't vanish. In fact, it multiplied in classical Athens. New versions of labyrinths began appearing on ceramics and coins. None were practical, too small to walk, too abstract to function. They weren't meant to trap. They were symbols, markers of complexity, icons of ancient knowledge. And who was always paired with these diagrams? Ariadne, often shown not inside the maze, but beside it, holding a thread, or a spindle, or a crown. The implication was clear. She was not a prisoner of the labyrinth. She was its master. In later Roman mosaics, especially those found in coastal villas, Ariadne appears as a figure of passage, the one who guides you through complexity. She had been elevated from myth to metaphor, just as Daedalus had built the walls, Ariadne had made them navigable. The final mythic image of Ariadne is celestial. After her marriage to Dionysus, she is gifted a crown, often described as golden or radiant, which he later casts into the sky, forming the constellation Corona Borealis. Astronomers today still refer to it by that name, the Northern Crown, but the symbolic weight of this moment is rarely explored. Why a crown? Why the sky? The crown was the highest symbol of sovereignty. But Ariadne was never a sovereign in the traditional sense. She was not a war leader or lawmaker. Her power came from knowing the system so intimately that she could dissolve it. The sky, meanwhile, was the ultimate maze, the turning of constellations, the spiral of seasons. Placing her crown among the stars was, in a way, a final recognition. Here is the woman who understood how to move through complexity. Here is the one who made the invisible visible. Here is the one who knew which thread to pull. And so, the crown became both reward and record, the first and perhaps only promotion from operations manager to minor goddess. Long after Ariadne's name faded from epic poetry, her patterns endured in ritual. In Delos, dancers performed a ritual known as the Geranos, or crane dance, a spiraling formation said to mimic Theseus's escape. But some scholars believe it was older, that it honored Ariadne's path through ritual choreography. In Eleusinian cults, certain priestesses wore looped girdles or belts, believed to signify their ability to navigate sacred spaces, a tradition some believe echoes Ariadne's symbolic thread. In Roman Saturnalia festivals, thread was used in games of navigation and fortune, passed from person to person in circles, sometimes dyed red, symbolizing vitality or memory. All of these, while varied in detail, share a common idea. Ariadne wasn't remembered for slaying anything. She was remembered for showing the way out. Modern historians and anthropologists have begun to reevaluate figures like Ariadne, those who worked in the margins of myth but at the center of systems. She did not battle monsters, but she did contain them. She didn't wage war, but she sustained the civic ritual through logistics. She didn't escape for love. She escaped because she saw the exit before anyone else. Her brilliance wasn't in drama, it was in detail. We often overlook such figures because their labor is quiet, repetitive, procedural, but without it, civilization collapses. Ariadne teaches us that infrastructure is sacred, not because it's exciting, but because it holds the weight of entire cultures. Ariadne's story ends in transformation, not tragedy, not triumph, but elevation. From royal administrator to forgotten exile to divine guide of passage, she evolves, not by seeking power, but by mastering structure. In a world of mazes, she didn't just walk through, she left a map behind. And perhaps that's the true legacy, not the escape itself, but the generosity of the thread, that slim, silken promise that even the most tangled systems can be unraveled, understood, and ultimately rewoven into something new. The myth of Prometheus is familiar. A titan, sympathetic to humanity, steals fire from the gods and gives it to mortals. For this, Zeus punishes him by chaining him to a rock where an eagle devours his liver daily. Each night, the liver regenerates. Each morning, the eagle returns. An infinite loop of biological horror. But what is often overlooked is just how mechanically precise this punishment is. It's not an outburst of wrath. It's ritualized enforcement. The myth doesn't read like a dramatic act of vengeance. It reads like a standardized sentencing. A carefully calibrated sentence doled out by a divine bureaucracy, consistent, repeatable, eternal. And that raises the question, who designs a punishment like this? Prometheus's crime is often romanticized. He defied Zeus, brought fire to humankind, and became a symbol of rebellion. But from the Olympian perspective, what he did wasn't heroic. It was a breach of jurisdictional authority. Fire wasn't just warmth. It was the foundation of technology, autonomy, and potential independence. In short, power, Olympian control, depended on mortals needing them. By giving humans fire, and by extension, the capacity to cook, forge, craft, and defend, Prometheus had disrupted the divine monopoly. If we view fire as a kind of cosmic technology, Prometheus committed an act of unauthorized distribution. He violated what we might call the Divine Use Licensing Agreement, DULA, and the punishment. It reads like a clause from an ancient celestial contract. In the event of unauthorized fire dissemination, the offending party will be bound indefinitely to a remote mountainous structure and subject to cyclical organ consumption, cold, specific, non-negotiable. Let's examine the daily torment itself. Why the liver? Why an eagle? Why daily regeneration? The liver. In many ancient cultures, the liver was considered the seat of emotion and vitality. It was believed to store courage, blood, and life force. By attacking the liver, the punishment wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It attacked hope, the eagle, not just any bird. The eagle was Zeus's personal symbol, a divine creature often used for enforcement. Think of it less as a bird and more as a celestial enforcement drone sent to execute punishment with no discretion or variation. Regeneration. This is where the bureaucratic texture becomes undeniable. Prometheus doesn't bleed out, doesn't die. The sentence is structured for maximum duration with predictable resets, no variance, no failure of organs, no expiration. The body heals at the exact rate needed to ensure perpetual compliance. The eagle returns on schedule. Every morning there is no parole, no hearing, but as a work schedule. 6 o'clock, awakened by eagle shadow. 6:05, 7:30, organ removal process. 7:30 to 20 o'clock, isolation, mild pain, liver regrowth begins. 20:06 o'clock, full regeneration, no conversation, no variation, no external input. This is not a dramatic punishment. It is a logistical trap, a closed-loop system, perfectly regulated for suffering with no climax, no catharsis, which is perhaps why the story lingers, because it mirrors a certain kind of human experience, the endless, repetitive labor of being punished not for rebellion, but for making the system obsolete. Zeus, by myth, ordered the punishment. But Zeus didn't design it. Just as kings don't draft policy documents, someone had to codify the terms. Was it Themis, goddess of divine law? Or perhaps Moirai, the fates, who regulated mortal and immortal destinies alike? Some ancient fragments suggest the punishment of Prometheus may have been standard practice for divine-class beings who disrupted mortal dependency. A lost play by Aeschylus, referenced in later Roman commentaries, alludes to other, lesser titans who faced similar organ-based cycles, though none lasted as long as Prometheus. It seems that among immortals, punishment must be infinite, not to cause pain, but to serve as a warning, a bureaucratic deterrent, while others in mythology fight or bargain their way out of doom. Prometheus simply waits. He does not scream. He does not beg. He endures. And in that endurance, something strange happens. Time passes. The world changes. Mortals, now armed with fire, build societies, weapons, languages. They worship less. They think more. And Prometheus, chained, bleeding, forgotten, becomes less a warning and more a symbol. In this way, even as his liver regrows, so does his legacy. Prometheus's torment is remembered as a mythic spectacle, but beneath the feathers and stone lies something quieter, a process designed not only to punish, but to maintain a narrative. His punishment wasn't about justice or even vengeance. It was about control. This section will explore how Prometheus became less a criminal and more a symbol, and how his carefully crafted agony served not just the gods but the structure of Olympian legitimacy. In any legal or theological system, punishment serves two purposes: retribution, to exact a price for wrongdoing; deterrence, to prevent others from attempting the same. Prometheus's punishment seems excessive for the former, but perfect for the latter. Let's look at the key elements. Location. He is bound to a remote cliff in the Caucasus, not deep within the underworld, not erased, but exposed. He is visible to gods and men alike. Duration. Infinite, not ending with forgiveness or repentance. Its very perpetuity speaks louder than any divine speech ever could. Precision. It is administered the same way each day. No escalation, no mercy. A perfectly automated system. This is not personal vengeance. This is propaganda through pain. Zeus, in crafting this punishment, made an example not just of Prometheus, but of ideas, rebellion, technological empowerment, compassion for mortals. Each was quietly stitched into the sentence, and each daily was devoured along with that liver. Mountains, in Greek cosmology, are not just geological features. They are thresholds between worlds. Think of Olympus, the meeting place of gods. Think of Othrys, the stronghold of titans. Think of the rugged Caucasus, where Prometheus was chained. Mountains were neither fully divine nor fully mortal realms. They were liminal spaces, ideal for containing disruptive entities. Prometheus's cliffside wasn't a prison cell. It was a natural courtroom, permanently in session. His suffering was the verdict, the trial, and the testimony all at once. Why the liver and not the heart? Why not endless strangulation or drowning? Because the liver regenerates. Ancient Greeks believed the liver was the body's seat of desire and foresight. It was also a sacrificial organ, often read during animal rituals to interpret divine will, a practice known as hepatoscopy. By targeting Prometheus's liver, the gods weren't just inflicting pain, they were symbolically erasing his foresight. Remember? Prometheus's name means forethought, reenacting a divine ritual, where the sacrificial organ is repeatedly consumed, not by priests, but by Zeus's eagle. Prometheus's daily suffering became a ceremony, a macabre form of cosmic bookkeeping. Each cycle was a divine audit, proof that justice, however unpleasant, was consistent. In modern readings, the eagle is often seen as an extension of Zeus's power. but its role is more specific. It is the executor of protocol. Unlike other mythic punishments, which involve dialogue, trickery, or emotional confrontation, Prometheus's eagle is silent. It arrives, performs its duty, leaves. No persuasion, no error. Think of it as a biological compliance officer. It never misses a day. It doesn't overpunish. It doesn't innovate. It is, in many ways, the perfect bureaucrat, carrying out its task with unwavering reliability. Where gods could be jealous, erratic, or swayed by prayer, the eagle follows only the terms of sentence. This introduces a chilling reality. Prometheus was not punished by wrath. He was punished by consistency. Zeus could have executed Prometheus. He didn't. He could have exiled him. He didn't. He chose instead the most expensive, most visibly maintained, and least reversible punishment. Mythology. Why? Because Zeus's authority, after the Titanomachi, the war with the Titans, was not as secure as the myths would later suggest. Prometheus wasn't just a defector. He was a Titan with influence, one who had sided with mortals, and most dangerously, one who had made the gods look vulnerable. To kill him would have made a martyr. To forgive him would have made a precedent. But to chain him publicly, painfully, indefinitely, was to remind everyone, every day, that defiance could be contained, even genius, even mercy. But the sentence had one unintended consequence. Time. Prometheus was immortal, and immortal prisoners can wait. While his body suffered, his mind endured. And in that long silence, he observed. Some ancient sources claim that Prometheus knew a secret, that Zeus's reign would one day be challenged by a child more powerful than him. This prophecy gave Prometheus leverage. He never spoke it aloud, but he waited. Let it ferment. Thus, even while immobilized, Prometheus remained dangerous, not for what he could do, but for what he might say. And the longer he waited, the more powerful that silence became. For centuries, perhaps millennia, Prometheus endured the sentence etched into the divine bureaucracy of Olympus. Each day, his liver was devoured. Each night, it regrew. The punishment had no expiration, no clause for clemency, no public reconsideration. But then, one day it ended. Prometheus was freed, and the gods, for all their control, enforcement, and consistency, could do nothing to stop it. This final section explores how even the most tightly wound system fails. How Prometheus's story ends not with defiance, but with persistence, and how bureaucratic punishment, no matter how airtight, is still subject to time. Enter Heracles, son of Zeus, mortal demigod, tasked with 12 labors as a form of atonement. On one of these quests, he journeys near the Caucasus Mountains and encounters the suffering Titan. The myth is straightforward. Heracles, moved by pity, shoots the eagle with an arrow, breaking the cycle. He unchains Prometheus. The punishment is over, but the implications are anything but simple. First, who authorized this? Zeus's own son intervenes in a punishment decreed by Zeus himself. No records mention Zeus objecting. There is no divine retaliation. No further trial, no reinstated punishment. In bureaucratic terms, this is the equivalent of a junior official bypassing a Supreme Court sentence. And being allowed to do so, something had changed. The gods had grown quiet. Mortals had grown clever. A relic. When Heracles kills the eagle, he does more than interrupt a punishment. He breaks the enforcement mechanism. For eons, The eagle had served as the executor of divine will, appearing without fail, but it had no autonomy. It never questioned its orders. It was part of a system, and when it died, no replacement came. No second eagle, no thunderbolt, no angry decree. The process simply stopped, and no one had the power or will to restart it. This is perhaps the most haunting truth in the myth. Bureaucracies don't collapse with drama. They collapse with silence. Some versions of the myth say that Prometheus had to agree to certain terms to gain freedom. These varied by source. In some, he had to wear a ring forged from his old chains, a symbolic marker of his punishment, ensuring he always carried a trace of it. In others, he had to divulge the prophecy he had guarded, that a son born of Zeus would overthrow him, and promise never to aid such a child, regardless of the terms. What's important is this: Prometheus outlived the punishment. He made the sentence irrelevant, not because he fought, but because he waited. This is the most profound kind of resistance, not revolution, not rebellion, endurance. After his release, Prometheus re-enters mythology not as a victim, but as a figure of foresight. He is no longer chained, no longer criminal. Instead, he becomes a teacher. In later myths and mystery traditions, Prometheus is associated with alchemy, fire as transformation, astronomy. His name linked to stars and timing. Knowledge, secret wisdom, passed to select initiates. He is no longer punished for fire. He embodies it. The gods had tried to erase him through repetition, but repetition, over time, becomes ritual, and ritual becomes legacy. Zeus's punishment had been absolute. It was meant to stand forever. But what it failed to anticipate was entropy, not in the physical sense, but in the emotional and political. Over time, fewer gods cared. Fewer mortals remembered the original crime. The punishment, once frightening, became quaint. The eagle, once divine, became a curiosity by the time Heracles arrived. The cycle had no audience, and without an audience, what is punishment? Just repetition, just noise, just another piece of machinery running with no purpose until someone, eventually, turns it off. Prometheus's real victory wasn't stealing fire. It was proving that even divine bureaucracy, no matter how perfect, is still finite. It cannot account for boredom. It cannot outlast curiosity. It cannot withstand change. And so the Titan who brought humanity, technology, foresight, and rebellion became the first to prove a deeper truth, that endurance is more powerful than decree, that systems cannot survive without belief, that even punishment must someday end. Most tellings of Atlantis begin with collapse, tidal waves, divine wrath, or hubris, punished in a single cataclysmic moment. But that's not where real stories begin. Real stories begin with spreadsheets, with census logs, with slow shifts in policy and unnoticed strains in civic budgets. The story of Atlantis isn't about how it sank. It's about how it managed to float for so long in the first place. And as we'll see, that management wasn't a miracle. It was a bureaucratic grind. Our only primary account of Atlantis comes from Plato in two dialogues, Timaeus and Crietos. He describes it as an island empire, larger than Libya and Asia combined, centered on concentric rings of land and water, governed by the descendants of Poseidon himself. We are told Atlantis had a powerful navy, vast agricultural fields, and elaborate canal system temples, clad in orichalcum, a fictional or forgotten metal, an economy rich in trade and tribute, but beneath these flourishes lies a much more ordinary, overlooked reality. Atlantis was an empire, and empires, no matter how advanced, are not sustained by technology or gods alone. They're sustained by taxation. The Atlantean Empire stretched across islands, continents, and coastal colonies. To maintain such a reach, it required agricultural quotas from outlying territories, shipping records for merchant fleets tribute, schedules for lesser city-states resource, inventories for metallurgy, construction, and ritual. Plato mentions that each of Poseidon's 10 sons was given a portion of the realm to govern, but make no mistake, this wasn't a feudal fantasy. It was a federated tax model. Each district sent its contribution to the central capital, where priests and magistrates would record yields in temple archives, weigh imported materials at customs stations, audit local governors for shortfalls. It is likely that Atlantis, though remembered as a utopia, was laden with paperwork, or at least clay tablets. Its famed canals may have moved water, but its real lifeblood flowed through administrative routes. The capital of Atlantis was arranged in concentric rings of water and land, an awe-inspiring design meant to reflect harmony and cosmic order. But imagine maintaining it. Bridges spanning every ring, each requiring upkeep locks and water gates to manage levels. During flooding season, sanitation channels to prevent stagnation or disease. Traffic control, maritime and pedestrian elite. Ring likely had its own overseer, its own maintenance budget, its own fleet of canal workers and inspectors. And as with any advanced system, breakdowns would occur slowly. A collapsed bridge here, a silted canal there, a missing engineer's report, until the illusion of utopia began to crack. Atlantis was famous for its wealth. Its temples gleamed, its statues loomed, its armies marched in bronze and leather and gold. But luxury, by its nature, is renewable. To maintain its grandeur, Atlantis depended not just on internal production, but external extraction. Conquered territories were required to send precious metals, livestock, ceremonial animals, skilled laborers, exotic materials. Stand when those sources dried up, whether through drought, rebellion, or trade disruption, the central administration had to compensate. That likely meant tax increases, higher quotas, new levies on merchants, restrictions on movement, requisition of private assets. Over time, such pressures would erode loyalty, strain logistics, and turn neighbors into dissidents. One underappreciated element in Plato's account is the central role of priests in administering justice and economic policy. The 10 kings met every 5 or 6 years to conduct ceremonies and settle disputes. They did so with ritual blood, animal sacrifice, and tablets of law inscribed on imperishable materials. This was not just governance, it was sacred administration. When taxation failed or complaints arose, it wasn't a magistrate who handled them, it was a priest. This blending of the sacred and the civic may have made dissent blasphemous, but it also meant that reforms were slow, debate was limited, and corruption could hide behind ritual. The system endured until, quietly, it didn't. Plato tells us that Atlantis eventually grew morally corrupt. But what does that mean? Who kept a portion for themselves? Priests who accepted lavish gifts for leniency, engineers who falsified canal inspections, and then the empire, no longer lubricated by order, began to grind. Imports slowed, temples cracked, citizens grew weary of tribute. The myth says a flood swallowed the island, but maybe the flood was metaphorical. Maybe Atlantis drowned in its own systems. We've seen that Atlantis was not just a shining city, it was a machine, a delicate interplay of canals, tribute routes, district governors, priestly intermediaries, and seasonal reviews. For a while, that machine ran smoothly. Too smoothly, perhaps, but every system, even divine ones, has limits. This section explores what happened when Atlantean administration began to crack, not from war or weather, but from overconfidence, fatigue, and civic overload. Atlantis's federal model, as described by Plato, was built on decentralized taxation. 10 sons of Poseidon ruled 10 districts. These regions sent regular tributes to the capital, measured, weighed, and recorded by a priestly bureaucracy. On paper, it was balanced, but in practice, some districts were richer in ore, others had better farmland, some controlled ports and trade routes. The result was uneven burden sharing. District 3, flush with fisheries, may have met its quotas easily, while District 7, plagued by soil depletion, struggled year after year. And when struggling, districts failed to deliver. Penalties, late fees, resource seizure, temple audits. The gods, we are told, watched all. But really, it was clerks and inspectors who carried out divine will. Over time, resentment festered, not at Poseidon, but at the capital's silent accountants. The most prized substance in Atlantis was orichalcum, a mysterious metal said to glow red like fire. The inner temple walls were clad in it, statues, pillars, crowns, coins, but no known mine has ever revealed orichalcum. Its source remains mythical. But in economic terms, it represents something unsustainable, a material of prestige, required for ceremonial offerings, limited in supply, expected in increasing quantities. Temples required regular deposits of it to remain in Poseidon's favor. But once reserves dwindled, Atlantis likely turned to substitutes, alloys, false filings, symbolic payments. Taught fraud crept in. Priests had to test each tribute. Doubt grew. Rituals stalled. Offerings were returned, rejected, or punished. The symbolic currency of Atlantis had become its liability. Plato tells us that every 6 years, the 10 kings gathered to sacrifice bulls in Poseidon's temple. They would cut the throats over sacred stone tablets and read the laws of the realm aloud. Each king swore to uphold justice, refrain from waging war unjustly, and maintain their duties. It was a binding ritual, civic and sacred. But imagine the pressure: a governor, behind on grain quotas, forced to recite oaths before his peers. A king who accepted bribes, now offering sacrifices with blood-stained hands. Laws that no longer matched reality. Read aloud, simply because they must be. Ritual became ritualistic. A process once meant to bind a civilization began to hollow it. The ceremonies continued, but belief thinned, compliance became performance. No clay tablets from Atlantis have been recovered, but if they were, what might they show? Unfulfilled quotas, backlogged canal repairs, delayed food shipments, a rise in tax exemptions for priestly families, a decline in temple attendance. These are the signs not of disaster, but of institutional fatigue. The people didn't revolt. They simply stopped participating. Local officials extended deadlines. Priests overlooked shortages. Accountants falsified returns. Inspectors reported what superiors wanted to hear. And as the paperwork grew more complex, more contradictory, more impossible to track, no one knew which part of the empire was actually still working. Atlantis, before it sank, became a state of invisible collapse. The Atlantean pattern is not unique. Compare it to Babylon, where grain quotas eventually outpaced rainfall. Rome, where the bureaucracy outlived the army. Qin China, where strict legalist records buried. Local governance. Atlantis simply did it, sooner or more perfectly. It scaled its systems faster than its culture could adapt. It had no error margin, and so when the final stressor came, whether flood, quake, or political schism, there were no resilient backups, no adaptive reforms, no functional memory, just concentric rings sinking neatly in silence. When Plato wrote that Atlantis fell in a single day and night, he gave us a clean ending, an image of waves crashing over golden temples, of ships lost mid-sea, of statues swallowed whole. But real endings don't work that way, especially not for civilizations. They do not fall overnight. They unravel slowly, document by document, ledger by ledger, until only the illusion of stability remains. In this final section, we explore how the last days of Atlantis were likely not marked by panic, but by paperwork. A key flaw in advanced bureaucracies is not inefficiency, it's invisibility. Atlantis had likely created layers of record-keeping so intricate that no single person could understand them all. Canal inspection logs, naval readiness surveys, priesthood food allowances, shrine maintenance rosters. Each functioned within its own silo, individually. These departments probably reported minor shortages, temporary delays, slight deviations, but no one was tracking the overall pattern. No one noticed that grain deliveries were shrinking at the same time that temple demands were rising. Canals needed dredging, just as ship traffic increased. Regional governors had stopped responding, not rebelliously, but out of sheer overload. By the time the central administrators understood the convergence, there was no time left to act. Atlantis wasn't destroyed. It was too well managed to be flexible. According to Plato, the final generation of Atlanteans had become unjust, corrupted by wealth and power. But corruption doesn't always come from greed. It often comes from desperation. Imagine a local overseer, years behind on stone deliveries, forges a report to keep his position. A harbor inspector skips formal logs in favor of oral approvals to speed up delays. A priest quietly cancels a midwinter ritual, hoping no one notices. Each decision is small, reasonable, even necessary, but together they signal a system running on exception rather than rule. Plato may have seen this as moral decline, but we might interpret it differently. A civilization buried under its own standards. A priesthood asked to uphold rituals no longer supported by the economy. Administrators trying to enforce a past that no longer matched the present. In modern terms, Atlantis didn't need an earthquake. It simply timed out. The image of Atlantis submerging is symbolic, but not impossible. Tsunamis, earthquakes, coastal erosion, all real threats in the Mediterranean. But when disaster finally struck, Atlantis likely didn't resist. There were no emergency drills, no fleet evacuations, no contingency plans. They weren't suppressed by outside invasion. They were suffocated by internal compression. One temple's accounting error, one unmaintained seawall, one missed grain shipment. That's all it takes. We remember Atlantis for its mystery, for its symmetry, for its fall. But we forget the people who kept it functioning. The clerk who double-checked canal floodgates every morning. The junior scribe who managed livestock tallies in provincial shrines. The priest who rationed incense so that 3 cities could still burn offerings each month. The harbor foreman who walked every dock with a broken foot just to keep ships on schedule. These were the real Atlanteans, not the kings, not the generals, but the mid-tier civil servants. They held the empire together until the burden became too much. Plato ends the story abruptly. The island is gone. No survivors, no relics, only the warning. But imagine what truly lingered. A sailor who turned back early and saw the final spray from a distance. A distant colony that never received its tax instructions again and slowly forgot its tribute. A priest who kept lighting candles to Poseidon, unsure why the capital had gone silent. Atlantis faded not in fire, but in quiet disconnection. No one told them it was over. It simply stopped being there. Atlantis may have stood as the most organized society in ancient memory, but organization is not the same as sustainability. Too many layers, too few questions, too much prestige, too little adaptation, and in the end, not a scream, but a sigh, the weight of gold-covered law collapsing under its own ceremonial dust. So the real question is not, when you think of Hermes, you likely picture winged sandals, a caduceus staff, and a mischievous smirk. Messenger of the gods, patron of thieves, guide of souls, a blur across sky and land. But behind this image lies something stranger and far more bureaucratic. Hermes wasn't just fast, he was responsible for the first organized communication system in mythology. And like all systems, it started not with magic, but with a problem. The Greek pantheon, for all its power, suffered from a logistical issue. The gods lived on Mount Olympus, mortals on earth, and the underworld far below. Each realm had its own timelines, natural and supernatural barriers, and yet messages had to flow. Zeus needed reports from battlefields. Hera needed updates on prayers and oaths. Apollo had to coordinate temple festivals across Delos and Delphi. Hades needed people to stop showing up unannounced. It quickly became clear. Even gods needed a courier system. Enter Hermes. Hermes's first title was not messenger, it was psychopomp, a guide of souls. He helped the dead cross into the underworld. But the job quickly expanded. As mortal life became more complex, so did divine administration. The Olympians began issuing edicts, judgments, blessings, cursoling updates for festivals, and each required delivery. Hermes became the courier, but also the central dispatch, the protocol enforcer, the case reviewer. Imagine a divine inbox, constantly full. Appeals, prayers, complaints. Hermes triaged them all. Over time, his role became less mythic and more managerial. Despite his mythic status, Hermes operated with an efficiency grounded in practicality. Winged sandals, Talaria, often cited as magical, but consider them a symbolic representation of optimized route efficiency. He didn't teleport, he simply knew the best paths. Caduceus' staff, traditionally associated with medicine today, but originally a diplomatic pass, it signaled neutrality. Hermes could enter any realm, mortal or divine, without being attacked. The staff meant, "I'm here on official business." Pedasos' winged hat, not merely fashionable. It was likely symbolic of identification, marking him as exempt from normal rules, customs, and border permissions. He was the first to wear a uniform in service of a trans-realm communication network. Delivering messages wasn't just about speed, it was about navigation. Hermes had to master mortal geography, mountain passes, river crossings, seasonal hazards, divine territories, Olympus stairways, celestial corridors, shifting mythic gates, sunderworld paths, the 5 river Styx, Lethe, Acheron, Cocytus, each with unique properties, dream routes, where messages were sent via sleep and symbol, often requiring metaphoric translation. He didn't just run, he mapped, and these maps, if they had been drawn, would have been the first interim postal routes in history. In mortal courts, proof is required. But how do you prove a god heard your prayer, that an oath was witnessed, that an offering was received? Hermes was the solution. He functioned as witness to oaths, validator of transactions, threader to sender, officer for failed sacrifices, a broken promise. Hermes recorded it, a misdelivered prayer. He rerouted it, a temple dispute. He carried the paperwork, often to multiple gods simultaneously. He was not just a messenger, he was a divine notary. The more Hermes delivered, the more he was asked to mediate. Gods argued, mortals begged, souls wandered, and somehow it was always Hermes who stood in the middle. In myths, he negotiated Persephone's seasonal return, with Hades delivered Pandora and her box to Epimetheus. With no follow-up support, assisted Odysseus. With divine intel and route-finding Ginnervand in countless moments, where gods couldn't be bothered to appear in person over time, he became more than a courier. He became the glue dot, and all without formal recognition. No temples to rival Zeus, no epic hymns, no festivals named for his name alone. Just a god doing the divine equivalent of mail sorting, customer service, and conflict resolution. So here's a question. In the previous section, Hermes emerged not as a simple messenger, but as the first interdimensional logistics officer, the one who ensured that gods stayed informed, mortals got answers eventually, and oaths held their weight. But the real intrigue isn't in the delivery of divine communication. It's in the infrastructure that developed around it. This section explores how Hermes's delivery routes became administrative networks, how messages were cataloged, and how even gods required a form of service coordination. The gods were not omnipresent. They didn't listen to every mortal at all times. That's a later theological upgrade. In early Greek cosmology, prayers were requests, and they required delivery. Hermes developed a rudimentary triage system: high-priority messages, direct offerings, sacrificial oaths, life or death, battlefield pleas, recurring rituals, festival invocations, grain blessing chants, temple petitions, low-tier noise, casual prayers, unqualified requests, or repeated queries already denied. Hermes's job wasn't just to deliver prayers, it was to filter them. He had to determine who was worthy of divine attention, whether the message was correctly formatted, ritually, which God had jurisdiction, what timeline the request required. This made him less a courier and more a gatekeeping administrator. A system without Hermes would have collapsed into noise. The Greek pantheon was not streamlined. Consider a prayer for rainfall could be addressed to Zeus, Demeter, or even Poseidon, depending on context. A merchant's plea for safe travel might involve Hermes, Apollo, or Artemis. A woman in childbirth might pray to Hera, Artemis, or Eileithyia, who gets the message. Hermes had to make judgment calls. In many ways, he became the interdepartmental switchboard of Olympus. If two gods claimed authority, Hermes had to prioritize based on divine precedent. Recall, past case history myths were, after all, cumulative. Possibly negotiate who took the prayer, at least one Orphic fragment. Hermes is described as the tongue that speaks before the god responds. He wasn't just a voice, he was protocol. We often imagine gods sending messages to mortals in visions or dreams. But how do those messages get there? Once again, Hermes. Unlike other gods, Hermes could move among mortals without ceremony. Number incense, no temple. He could appear as a shepherdé, travelé, traderé wind, a shadow, or a whispered instinct. This flexibility made him the perfect medium for divine guidance or correction. He didn't just carry messages to gods. He delivered results. A merchant avoiding stormy seas, Hermes, a shepherd following a lost goat to a hidden shrine, Hermes, a criminal suddenly changing course, Hermes. He was divine automation running silently in the background. But what happened when a message couldn't be delivered? What if the request was too vague? The prayer came from a forbidden source. The ritual was flawed. Hermes managed the first divine return-to-sender system. Failed messages didn't vanish. They circled back as dream fragments. Soon silences bad omens in some traditions. The failure of a prayer was seen as Hermes's signal, a soft denial rather than divine wrath. He was the buffer between rejection and destruction. His existence made divine silence bearable. As Hermes's network grew, so did expectation. Mortals began to assume that the gods were reachable at all times. Priests invoked Hermes in temples, not just for trade, but for clarity, for confirmation that their messages would be heard. This caused theological problems. If Hermes could always deliver, then why weren't the gods always responding? Suddenly, silence became suspect. Hermes was caught between divine indifference, mortal anxiety, and the growing need for responsiveness. Metrics E had unintentionally built the first customer support system with no escalation team, no refunds, and no vacation over time. Hermes's reliability changed the way mortals thought about messages. They no longer needed visible gods. They trusted the system. Offerings were made with confidence that they'd be received. Prayers became contracts. Oaths, once fragile, now carried the weight of divine delivery tracking. Hermes had transformed faith from a mystical hope into a functional channel. His greatest feat wasn't speed or cleverness. It was making the gods seem reachable. By now, Hermes had become indispensable, not for his charm, not for his lineage, but for his reliability. He wasn't the strongest god, or the most worshipped, but he was the only one who kept the system moving. This final section explores how Hermes's responsibilities scaled with civilization, how he became the prototype for communication systems across empires, and what it means when even the divine rely on infrastructure. As Greek city-states expanded, so did the rituals. More festivals, more oracles, more regional cults, more prayers to gods with overlapping domains. Each required attention, response, or at least the illusion of receipt. Hermes became the de facto routing layer, not only between gods and mortals, but between belief and administration. In Delos, messengers were blessed in his name. In Athens, merchants offered coins at Hermes' statues before voyages. In Sparta, even the strictest soldiers acknowledged his authority before swearing oaths. He became the god of travel, commerce, boundaries, words. But what do all of these have in common? Movement, structure, pathways. Hermes wasn't a trickster. He was a transport network with sandals. As local temples proliferated, centralized worship of the Olympians became decentralized. A shrine to Apollo in Thebes wasn't the same as one in Delos. A votive offering to Hera in Corinth might not be recognized. In Argos, Hermes' system had to adapt. He enabled localized rituals to sync with larger festivals, token transfers, small objects sent between temples as symbolic receipts, message proxies, allowing one shrine to speak on behalf of another. These weren't mythic feats. They were workflow solutions. The temples, once isolated, began to form networks, not just of faith, but of information. Hermes was not just enabling belief, he was organizing it. As Hermes' role expanded, it grew invisible. He no longer appeared in myth as often, fewer epics, fewer confrontations. But this wasn't decline, it was absorption. His functions became so embedded in daily practice, in coinage, in contracts, in carved boundary stones, that people stopped seeing him as a deity. They saw the process. He had become the mythic embodiment of infrastructure. The system ran so well, they forgot it was being run. As Greek culture faded into Roman dominance, many gods changed. Hermes became Mercury, patron of trade, wealth, and communication. His staff, once a pasky, became a symbol of commerce and medicine. But by then, the idea of Hermes had already spread. Couriers in Persia operated under divine oath. Roman roads featured statues marking distances, sometimes attributed to Mercury. Early Christian angels were drawn with wings on their feet, a borrowed visual, metaphor of divine delivery. Hermes had transcended belief. He became infrastructure, ideology. Wherever there was a sealed message, a negotiated border, a guided soul, a system that moved things between places. Hermes was there, not worshipped, but used. There's an irony in Hermes' myth. The more reliable he became, the less credit he received. Temples to Zeus towered Athena's name was given to entire cities. But Hermes, the one who kept everything functional, was rarely honored. With grandeur, this is the fate of all successful systems. You only notice them when they break. You only praise them when they're gone. And so Hermes, god of paths, was gradually reduced to a statue at the crossroads, rubbed for luck, passed without pause, maintained without thought. Hermes was never about wings or speed. He was about continuity, about the unnoticed work that holds meaning. Together, he didn't rule from Olympus. He walked between. He didn't command. He connected. He didn't demand belief. He enabled it. In a world full of voices, divine, human, dying, rising. Hermes didn't speak for any of them. He just made sure they were heard. Dionysus is often remembered as the god of wine, ecstasy, and liberation, a deity of blurred boundaries, chaotic joy, and midnight dances. But even in the wildest festivals, someone had to file a form. Behind the revelry of Dionysian rites stood a quiet truth. You couldn't serve sacred wine without a permit. This story begins not in a vineyard, but in a city office, where priestesses and vintners alike waited to be approved, audited, or denied. By the 6th century BCE, the cult of Dionysus had moved from obscure rural shrines to urban temples. His festivals, most famously the city Dionysia in Athens, were no longer fringe affairs. They were municipal events, sponsored by the city, scheduled in the civic calendar, required by law to be observed, and that posed a problem. Wine, once had become sacred material, used in ritual libations, sacramental intoxication, public feasting, dramatic competitions. Where plays honored Dionysus, it was no longer enough to make wine. You had to be authorized to use it in religious space. And so, across Thebes and other cities, the first wine licenses began to appear. To distribute wine during Dionysian festivals, citizens needed temple-issued approval. Requirements varied by city, but generally included proof of vineyard ownership or partnership, of purity, no dilution, no foreign additives, written oath to use the wine only for sanctioned events, formal offering of the first barrel to the god witness. Signatures from at least 2 temple officials. These documents were recorded not in scrolls but in clay tablets or etched into lead sheets. Some archaeologists have uncovered wine regulations in Theban market zones, including maximum serving prices during festivals. And yet, despite the regulations, violations were constant. The Dionysian cult was built on release of the body, the mind, and social norms, but not everyone waited for permits. By the 5th century BCE, Thebes had developed underground wine cellars, rogue ceremonies held in forest groves, traveling vintners who bypassed temple taxes. These unlicensed gatherings were called theosoi, private Dionysian clubs, often operated without state recognition. Though seen as minor infractions, they deeply worried city officials, who feared loss of tax revenue, religious control, the spread of unsanctioned ecstasy. To control this, magistrates created a special civic position, the oinopolis, or wine registrar. His job: audit barrels, inspect parties. Festivals would pause when he arrived. Dancers went silent. Libations were hidden. No one wanted to be caught with blessed wine, and no paperwork. To complicate matters further, not all wine was sacred. Sacrificial wine, used in libations and oaths, had to be drawn from approved vineyards. Festival wine, consumed during processions or theater events, taxed at reduced civic rates. Private wine, made in homes, usually ignored by officials unless sold publicly, but the lines often blurred. One Theban complaint, preserved in fragments, involves a priestess accusing a local merchant of repurposing leftover sacrificial wine for tavern use. Her accusation wasn't moral, it was administrative. The wine poured for Dionysus must not be sold in copper cups to those who do not know his name. It was less about blasphemy and more about inventory control. Temple scribes had to track barrels received and redistributed oaths. fulfilled and violated officiants authorized to pour libations, ritual vessels, loaned and returned, or not one temple in Thebes reportedly had an annual wine audit, during which all ceremonial containers were weighed, recorded, and sealed. Failure to report could lead to ritual disqualification, a form of spiritual suspension. The festival might appear chaotic from the outside, but behind it stood rows of clay tablets, rolls of linen accounting sheets, and sleepless officials filing event summaries. Dionysus was the god of madness, of divine intoxication, and divine confusion. But his worship required timetables, permits, resource, management, compliance officers. This wasn't irony, it was infrastructure. To safely release chaos into a city, someone had to ensure it stayed within acceptable bounds, that the sacred wine was real, that the offerings were genuine, that no one poured ecstasy from a counterfeit cask. Thebes wanted the blessing of Dionysus. They just needed to track the barrels. When we last left Thebes, sacred wine was flowing, not just through vineyards, but through a slowly expanding bureaucracy of permissions, permits, and priestly protocols. But where wine flows, disputes follow. In this section, we look at how local governments, temple authorities, and private citizens clashed over Dionysian rituals, and how something as ephemeral as intoxication became subject to civic litigation. Theosoi. Private Dionysian groups were originally tolerated. They often consisted of women, often from the lower aristocracy or merchant class, traveling performers, especially from Thrace and Phrygia, where Dionysus's cult had older roots. These groups organized unofficial rites outside city-sanctioned festivals, while the state focused on theatrical Dionysia and regulated libations. The Theosoi met in caves, forest clearings, and occasionally rented homes to perform rites that involved wild dance, ecstatic, chanting, wine consumption, far exceeding permitted quantities, occasionally ritual sparagmos, animal sacrifice by dismemberment, rare but real. The state's concern wasn't religious blasphemy, it was administrative exposure. These unsanctioned gatherings lacked licensing, witnessing protocols. Some cities required medical personnel at major Dionysian events, and without regulation, Thebes feared chaos and legal liability. Yes, people tried. Theban council records, referenced by 3rd century scholars, describe a merchant who filed a formal grievance that Dionysian activity near the West Market had resulted in 2 broken amphiae, damaged stall, canopitha, spontaneous nudity of a client's wife, intermittent howling not associated with ritual. But Dionysus could not be summoned to court, so the complaint was redirected to the temple board of oversight, where it was dismissed due to lack of authenticated wine tags, meaning there was no proof the wine came from the official registry. The outcome: the merchant was fined for defaming ritual license holders. It wasn't about faith, it was about paperwork. In response to increasing complaints, Thebes created a new temporary office, the Epimeletes, Tun Dionysian, the overseer of Dionysian affairs. Their tasks included reviewing wine permits, quarterly monitoring ritual performance for excessive variation, investigating unauthorized libations outside designated zones, conducting interviews with local Theosoi leaders. To be clear, this was not a theological position. It was logistics and law enforcement. The overseer had the power to issue ritual citations, suspend licenses for up to 1 festival cycle, recommend citizens for temple blacklisting in one preserved edict fragment. The Epimelides warns, "Let no citizen pour for Dionysus without declaration. Let no wine be called sacred without witness. Let the vine not become lawless." It sounds poetic, but it's really a compliance memo. The major Dionysian festivals were structured like public contracts between citizens and the divine. Citizens were obligated to attend. Temple wine was rationed by district. Licenses were verified before the first libation was poured. Stage producers, called chorigoi, had to submit documentation proving they'd hired approved performers. Any deviation from the process risked fines, or, in rare cases, the postponement of an entire ritual segment. Imagine a spring festival delayed not by rain, but by a missing seal on the wine manifest. And yet, this very structure is what allowed Dionysus's chaos to function in urban life. The more freedom he represented, the more tightly his festivals were managed. One temple log from Thebes, reconstructed from fragmentary stone records, shows 14 barrels of ritual wine received, 14 accounted for by libation or offering, 2 barrels flagged. 4. Questionable origin, 3 citizens denied wine pouring privileges for unpaid dues. Even ecstasy had to be itemized. These records weren't obsessive, they were necessary. Because the civic authorities weren't afraid of religion. They were afraid of untraceable joy, unregulated celebration. Even sacred threatened the city's ability to predict, contain, and report on its citizens' behavior. Much of Dionysus's worship was female-led. Priestesses, dancers, singers, many were deeply versed in ritual calendars, wine inspection standards, standard oath-taking procedures. These women formed the invisible bureaucracy of Dionysian order. While men argued over licensing, it was often women who knew which vintners diluted which district, had the cleanest ceremonial jugs, which festival nights were likely to attract rogue thiosoithi, enforced compliance, not with scrolls, but with reputation. A priestess's approval or disapproval could determine whether your wine flowed during the procession. By the 4th century BCE, cities like Thebes had mostly integrated Dionysian rites into statecraft, but the tension remained. Wine and what it represented was always one cup away from violating a law. Dionysus wasn't feared because he was wild. He was feared because, even within order, he reminded the city of what it could not control. As the Dionysian cult matured in Thebes and other Greek cities, its wine rites grew from fringe ecstasy into a well-regulated civic affair. But no system holds indefinitely. Every cup poured in accordance with temple law, every libation sealed with approval, gradually gave way to fatigue, decentralization, and finally, forgetting. This final section explores the dissolution of the Dionysian wine bureaucracy, not through rebellion or catastrophe, but through paperwork that simply stopped mattering. Administrative collapse doesn't begin with fire, it begins with a lost barrel logan, unfiled wine oathi, postponed inspections, senior priestess retiring with no clear successor. By the 3rd century BCE, several key cities, including Thebes, show signs that Dionysian wine licensing was no longer consistently enforced. Wine permits were issued irregularly, fewer inspections were documented, temple offerings were accepted without formal seal. Overseers of Dionysian rites were replaced by more generic civic officials. What once required 5 signatures could now be approved with a nod. The machinery didn't break. It was simply left running unattended. As state oversight faded, private Dionysian ceremonies surged. The theosophy, once considered underground, became commonplace, not in forest groves, but in rented homes, small courtyards, and rural estates. Without state funding or festival mandates, citizens organized their own wine distributions, libation, dances, play, readings, seasonal celebrations, and with no regulatory body to audit them, these rites became personal. Some were sincere, some were indulgent, most were small, far from the grand civic theater Dionysus once commanded. But they had something the official rites no longer did, meaning born of choice, not mandate. One of the last known formal records related to Dionysian wine licensing comes from an inscription in central Boeotia, dated roughly 150 BCE. It reads, "Let all pour freely who honor the vine in spirit and balance. Let no barrel be bound by seal if the god himself does not ask it." Though poetic, it is administrative in tone, an official lifting of ritual regulation. It didn't cancel Dionysian worship. It simply authorized the enforcement apparatus. The temples no longer had the staff. The magistrates no longer had the interest. The people no longer needed permission, as Dionysian rites dissolved into household practice. Wine itself underwent a quiet transformation. It became agricultural, not liturgical. It was taxed for trade, not temple use. It was stored in amphorae marked with merchant stamps, not ritual inscriptions. The sacred cup became the dinner cup. The libation became the toast. What once required permits, signatures, priestesses, and compliance now lived in a simple act, a raised vessel, a shared glance, a sip. Still meaningful, but no longer tracked. The bureaucracy didn't kill Dionysus, it preserved him, just long enough for society to forget how dangerous he had once seemed. But in regulating ecstasy, Thebes created a mirror of itself, a god of madness, made manageable, a divine riot, performed on schedule, a cult of freedom, stamped, filed, and poured only when allowed. And then, just like that, it ended, not with a riot, not with a law, but with a generation who no longer remembered what the permits were. For Dionysus was never about control, but to bring him into the city, control was required. The city needed forms, labels, scribes, inspections, and eventually, the god, the real wild god, slipped between the lines. Maybe he was never in the wine at all. Maybe he was in the moment. People stopped asking for permission. Apollo was a god of many things, too many things. He ruled the sun. He spoke through oracles. He was patron of medicine, music, plague, poetry, and prophecy. He was expected to show up at wars, attend rituals, bless athletic contests, and host poetry slams. At sacred festivals, he was, quite possibly, the most overcommitted deity in Greek mythology, and like any overbooked public figure, Apollo had a problem that no myth directly addresses: time management. This is the story of how Apollo, god of order, struggled to meet the deadlines he created. Most gods had clear domains. Ares handled war. Poseidon did water. Artemis hunted things. Dionysus handled chaos, wine, and making paperwork difficult. But Apollo, his divine portfolio included solar operations, sunrise, sunset cycles, prophetic administration, Delphi, and other oracular sites. Musical and poetic patronage, he judged contests. Medical oversight, healing plagues, and inflicting them archery duties, symbolic and sometimes practical temple appearances, and seasonal festivals, city founding approvals, colonists sought his signs. Each of these demanded attention, presence, and often coordination with other deities. Apollo wasn't omnipresent. He had to show up, and there were only so many hours in a god's day. Apollo's chariot, drawn by flaming horses, pulled the sun across the sky. The image is poetic, but from a ritual perspective, it meant that every morning he was expected to be on time. Temple schedules across the Mediterranean, aligned with sunrise prayers, began as light hit the temple threshold. Sacrifices were timed. To the first shadow, farmers watched for solar angles to begin plowing. If Apollo was late, the entire agricultural rhythm of a city could slip. Some scholars believe that localized cults began assigning proxy sunrise rituals, minor deities, or personifications like Eos or Helios, not because Apollo wasn't powerful, but because he was frequently double-booked. Even in the ancient world, people invented delegation. The Delphic oracle was Apollo's most sacred channel, a priestess, known as the Pythia, who inhaled vapors and gave cryptic prophecies in Apollo's name. But here's what most myths don't mention. The oracle was only active 9 days per year. Prophecies were subject to seasonal timing. Based on Apollo's presence, visitors often waited weeks, sometimes months only. Those approved by temple clerks could receive a consultation. Other words, there was a waiting list. Pilgrims had to bring offerings, submit a written question, wait for administrative clearance, hope that their query was deemed worthy. Delphi was less a magical experience and more like waiting at a divine DMV. Apollo had too many cities hosting festivals in his honor. The Delia in Delos, the Pythian Games in Delphi, the Carnia in Sparta, countless local Apollo feasts in colonies from Anatolia to Italy. Each required processions, readings of hymns, athletic games, musical performances, divine signs of presence, eclipses, birds, or sudden prophetic statements, and cities coordinated with each other to avoid overlapping festivals. With mixed success, temple scribes kept calendars of Apollo's appearances, often speculating whether a festival was in person or via spiritual proxy. The gods never officially confirmed, but everyone assumed. Apollo had to prioritize. Apollo was also a god of plague and healing, a contradiction no one seemed eager to resolve. He could send disease with arrows. He could also lift it with favor. Cities frequently petitioned Apollo during epidemics. Offerings increased. Rituals grew elaborate. Prayers were sung nightly, but not every request was answered. As cities competed for his curative presence, complaints began to circulate in surviving inscriptions. Apollo has favored the coast and not the mountains. Let the god not delay. Again, as he did last summer, we await his light, not only in the sky, but in the lungs. Some cities turned to Asclepius, Apollo's son, for relief. Others developed temple hierarchies to manage the surge in healing requests. One fragment from a Delian priest reads, "We have logged all illness petitions this month. Should Apollo not arrive by solstice, we shall forward them to his delegate in a polite way of saying, were over it. Apollo was the god of music, lyres, choruses, poetic inspiration. He was expected to judge contests at festivals, and sometimes even perform via ritual invocation. But performance requires preparation. By the 4th century BCE, musicians began writing hymns in Apollo's absence, hoping their compositions might one day receive divine feedback, or at least divine tolerance. In Delphi, a group of festival performers petitioned the temple to establish pre-approved lyric structures so songs could be performed without Apollo's presence, just in case he was running late again. The temple agreed. Thus was born the earliest known instance of a pre-cleared performance license. In Section 1, we saw that Apollo was the most overcommitted god in Olympus, simultaneously responsible for prophecy, medicine, music, solar movement, and the coordination of festivals from Thebes to Delos. But what happens when a god of order begins to strain under the very order he represents? This section explores how Apollo's duties were fragmented, substituted, and bureaucratized over time, not to diminish his power, but to compensate for divine unavailability. In many myths, Apollo pulls the sun across the sky each day in a golden chariot. But earlier traditions, especially Homeric ones, assigned that duty to Helios, the older Titan god of the sun. So why the confusion? As Apollo's cult grew, he absorbed more roles, including solar oversight. This made sense symbolically. He was a god of light, clarity, vision, but it created a practical issue. Helios did one thing, Apollo did 20. Thus began a subtle division of labor. Apollo became the symbolic face of the sun, worshipped at dawn. Invoked in ritual, Helios became the logistical operator, the one who ensured the light still showed up on time. Several inscriptions refer to Helios as the driver and Apollo as the eye, suggesting a two-tiered system: technical execution and divine presence. It's the equivalent of a CEO taking credit for a sunrise, powered by a well-run back office. The Greek calendar was lunar, not solar. Months aligned with moon phases, not seasons. This meant frequent drift between months and the natural year. To manage this, Greek cities inserted intercalary months, extra months added every few years, often during festivals. Guess who had to approve these adjustments? Apollo, as the god of cosmic order and prophecy. He was seen as the ultimate authority on what day it truly was. Temple officials would consult oracles, interpret signs from the natural world, submit requests to shift festival dates. Sometimes the process worked. Other times, it resulted in double-booked festivals missed, planting cycles, conflicting prophecies from different cities. One surviving calendar fragment from Delphi shows a scratched-out line: "If Apollo does not signal by the 12th moon, we shall proceed as scheduled." Translation: we can't wait any longer. Apollo's core oracle was in Delphi, but as demand grew, regional oracles began to pop up. Didyma, in modern Turkey, Claros, Delasklis, local shrines with less official status. These oracles functioned semi-independently, but always claimed to speak on behalf of Apollo. They were essentially regional branches, like satellite offices issuing spiritual permits. Each one had a local priesthood day seasonal schedule, not year-round. A tiered system for pilgrims. Wealthy patrons were prioritized if Delphi was backlogged. Clients were often redirected to the Claros experience. and yet complaints arose. One inscription from Corinth accuses a lesser oracle of issuing a contradictory prophecy. We were told by Apollo in Delos to plant before the third moon. But Apollo in Claros, said the second. Which sun do we follow? There was no official reconciliation process. Apollo, for all his foresight, had no scheduling software. Apollo's musical patronage extended beyond inspiration. He was expected to judge competitions during festivals like the Pythian Games. But as music spread across regions, so did the demand for divine endorsement. To cope, some cities developed pre-screened musical canons, approved chord structures, permitted lyrical themes, ritual requirements for instruments. Certain festivals banned flutes. These compliance frameworks were sometimes blessed in Apollo's name, even if he never reviewed them. One Delian performer's diary carved into a temple wall reads, "The judges say it is Apollonic. I have not seen him, but perhaps he listens when no one does," which is a poetic way of saying standards are standing in for gods, even in matters of law. Apollo was summoned. Oaths taken before courts often invoked his name. Perjurers feared his retribution, but the gods do not always show up to enforce infractions. To address delays, some cities adopted holding oaths, temporary contracts, until Apollo's sign appeared, delayed judgments, cases postponed until a dream or omen confirmed guilt, clerical proofs of invocation, essentially. Ritual receipts that said, "We asked Apollo." He didn't say no. This formality became routine. Faith became procedure. Justice depended not on divine wrath, but on whether the priest lit the correct incense at the right time. By the Hellenistic period, Apollo's many duties had been decentralized. Helios handled solar mechanics, Asclepius took over medicine, the Muses governed inspiration, oracular priests managed prophecies, temple bureaucrats oversaw festival schedules. Scetus Apollo was still revered, but increasingly symbolic. The sun rose without his chariot. The festivals occurred without his signs. The songs were judged by humans. He had become a logo, a golden mask of order, beneath which systems quietly ran on their own. He remained revered, golden, musical, radiant. But the actual labor of his domains was delegated, localized, formalized. The rituals still bore his name, but fewer people expected him to actually show up. This final section explores how Apollo's overwhelming portfolio transformed him into a process, how societies replaced presence with rhythm, and what happens when reverence becomes routine. The Delphic Oracle. Once the spiritual heartbeat of Apollo's cult began to change. By the Roman period, oracular responses were pre-written in some temples. Pre-selected prophecies were stored and chosen based on ritual dice rolls or flame movements. The priestess still inhaled vapors, but few believed she was truly possessed. One fragment from a 1st century BCE visitor reads, "We received an answer in verse. It resembled one I heard in Sardis. I suspect the god recycles. Even faith had a template, and yet people still came. Why? Because the process itself was sacred. The waiting, the offering, the chanting. It created meaning, whether or not God whispered in the dark." By the classical period, most scholars acknowledged Helios as the actual sun operator, while Apollo remained its spiritual administrator. Temples still faced east, aligned with Apollo's light. Sunrise rituals invoked His name, poets praised him in verse at dawn, but behind the scenes, few expected divine intervention. They simply followed the schedule. Astronomers began to replace priests in calculating solstices. Sundials replaced shadows. Calendars became civic documents, not prophetic ones. The divine had been standardized. Cities no longer waited for signs to begin Apollo's festivals. Instead, they consulted tables of past celebrations, local omens recorded in bureaucratic logs, agricultural cycles confirmed by temple clerks. The Pythian Games, once a sacred event held when the gods signaled, were eventually held every 4 years on a fixed schedule. A festival once rooted in spontaneity of the divine became a regular civic event. Like tax day or grain tally season, Apollo's ritual presence was simulated. Through decorative masks, music in his traditional scales, scripts written generations earlier, in a sense, he was still there, but only as a recurring pattern in time. Even Apollo's music became measured. Hymns were inscribed on temple walls for reuse. Judges of musical contests used standardized scoring. Winners received prizes not based on divine inspiration, but on compliance with approved forms. Apollo had become a genre, one so well defined that it no longer needed its composer. What remained of Apollo was reliability. He rose with the sun. His festivals occurred on time. His statues were cleaned. His name appeared on schedules, contracts, and civic edicts. He had become the god of the dependable process, no longer feared, no longer summoned, but always assumed, a divinity not of presence, but of pattern. Apollo's myth is one of brightness, clarity, and mastery, but buried beneath the golden lyre and oracular fire is a quieter truth. He became too large to embody, and so his roles were distributed. His rituals became structure. His name became a metronome, ticking through centuries. He didn't vanish. He was institutionalized, and in doing so, he achieved a different kind of immortality, not through thunder or miracle, but through procedure. Hera is remembered in myth as the goddess of marriage and childbirth, but almost always through the lens of her jealousy. Myths dwell on her anger at Zeus's many infidelities, her punishments of his lovers, and her wrath toward children not her own. But what if we've misunderstood her? What if Hera wasn't simply a reactive figure, but the primary administrator of divine relationships, the keeper of celestial contracts, oaths, and jurisdictional order? Because long before love was romantic, it was bureaucratic, and in the ancient Greek world, Hera was not merely a goddess of marriage, she was the goddess of marital governance. Hera's temples were among the oldest and most administratively complex in Greece. At Argos, Samos, and Olympia, her sanctuaries held marriage registries, ritual scripts for oath ceremonious stored, contracts between noble families, records of dowries, and divine witnesses. These weren't just religious spaces, they were legal centers, especially in cities that linked law and ritual closely. Hera's cult wasn't built on affection, it was built on authority. In mythology, Hera is described as kind, serene, watchful, but within ritual, she was meticulous. A traditional marriage under Hera's blessing required a formal oath taken before a priestess or temple, a physalon, offering from both families, often livestock or food, a documentation of dowry terms, sometimes etched on votive items, a public meal, a symbolic ratification of the contract. Hera role was not to ensure love. Her role was to ensure that the union was sanctioned.